All right. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tzvi, for all the arrangements and logistics, which have been fabulous. I see you've recorded and put the previous ones online already. It's terrific. And I also thank Chaim Seiman. I don't know if he's here, but he did a lot in organizing the whole series, and I've certainly been enjoying them all so far. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to contribute. What I'd like to talk about tonight is really going to be, I hope, some insight that we can get to together into the mitzvah of counting towards Shavuot, counting the Omer, mitzvah Sefirat ha-Omer. And the way we're going to get there is actually by the first 2/3 of the evening, focusing quite a bit on the blessing that is made before performing the mitzvah of counting. Like any other mitzvah, I shouldn't say any, like many other mitzvot, there is a bracha before we perform the mitzvah. Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu al sfirat ha-Omer. And what I'd like to look at with you is what I would claim is a uniquely close relationship, a very, very tightly integrated relationship between the bracha, the blessing that introduces this mitzvah, and the actual performance of the mitzvah. And let me show you what I mean, and I'll ask you one or two questions so that we can look at this together. So section 1, I just want to introduce the unique connection here between performing the mitzvah of Sefirat ha-Omer and the blessing that we recite before performing it. Here is what the Rambam says. The Rambam, when he discusses the mitzvah Sefirat ha-Omer, tells us all kinds of rules about how to perform it. And then towards the end of his description of the rules, he says, oh yes, every evening when you are about to perform this mitzvah, you must first recite the blessing. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, shekidshanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu al Sefirat ha-Omer. Then you count. Now he says something that I have highlighted in blue. Mana velo berech. What if you counted but did not make the blessing? So what do you think? Still fulfill the commandment? Says the Rambam, yes. Yatsa, you fulfilled your duty. Ve'ino choser mevarech. In fact, that's it. You know, you fulfilled your duty for tonight. Do not count over again with the blessing. It would be too late to do that because you already fulfilled the obligation. Now, let me ask you, is this surprising to, does anyone think this is, I don't know, surprising or inconsistent? Let's say, you know, think of any other mitzvah, picking up a lulav on Sukkot. So if you pick up the lulav without making the blessing, do you still fulfill the commandment? If you've already done it, if you already picked it up, and then you remember 10 seconds later, oh, I forgot to make the blessing. Is it too late to make the blessing? Yes, that's the general rule. That's a general rule. In fact, the Rambam teaches us this in his general statement of the laws of blessings. If there's a blessing to be recited before performing a commandment, and you forget to do it, so you leave it out, and instead you just perform the commandment, you still fulfill your commandment, and it's too late. You don't go back and make the blessing. That's what he says here too. Mana velo berech yatsa ve'ino choser mevarech. You counted, you fulfilled your duty, don't count over again. This is a general rule for all mitzvot that the Rambam has taught us. Why does he bother to spell it out here? He actually does not spell it out anywhere else. Now, I say that with some confidence, not because I'm such an expert in Maimonides, but because one of the primary commentaries on the Rambam notes this. He says that the Kesef Mishnah says this is simple and follows the Rambam's consistent rule. And he doesn't offer any explanation, the Kesef Mishnah, of why it needs to be stated here. But it is, he says, pshita, this is simple. So why does the Rambam bother to state it here? So this is my question for you. What I'm going to do, since we probably absorbed this material now, is turn our faces back on and kind of throw it out. I'd like to unmute everybody if I can. I don't know if I can do that easily all at once, but I would, in any case, invite anyone who has a thought about this. I'm curious to hear, why would you think that for the commandment of Sefirat, this is the one example of a mitzvah that the Rambam chose to highlight, that the blessing is not critical. The blessing is not essential. He doesn't mention that by the reading of Megillah, or by the reciting of Hallel, or the eating of matzah, or sitting in a sukkah, or any of the other, many dozens, if not hundreds of commandments where there's some blessing to be made.
Is it possible because the only thing you're doing is actually counting?
Ooh.
Like, that's all the mitzvah is to count. It's not, whatever, more than that.
Yeah. All we do is count. Can you say more about that, Raman? And it's as opposed to like a more.
The others are more. There's action associated with it, like the action of taking the lulav and the action of sitting in the sukkah, and you're listening to the Megillah. But here you're making a bracha, and all you're doing is counting. Like, it's just, there's no other action associated with it. It seems more limited.
It's a limited action, and it's verbal.
Right.
Now, blessing is also verbal. So can we, let's kind of take that as our first step, what Robin has pointed out. And let's see if we can push that a bit further. So why might one at least be tempted to think that, boy, you better make a blessing, the blessing might be essential. How would you kind of complete that idea? You might think the blessing is essential here. I agree. I think it has something to do with the verbal nature of it, and as you say, it's kind of simple. It's all you're doing is counting.
Well, it's sort of what you were leading us up to. I think I'm happy for other people to speak, but is that the blessing is on counting, like you say, commanded us to count, and then you count.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just, as you were sort of saying, it's such a direct connection that you might think that, you need both parts.
Well, that is at least a big part of it to me. Perhaps that would even be sufficient by itself, but I want to kind of build from that with an analogy that Rabbi Soloveitchik taught, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. I have a book called Hararei Kedem that is a student of his put out with a bunch of his lectures. So he didn't write it himself, Rav Soloveitchik, but it has his ideas. And to explain this Rambam, he compared it. He said, think about Kiddush on Friday night. There is a mitzvah with our words, remember to hallow the day of Shabbat. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho. That's the underlying biblical commandment. Now you could do that. That's a pretty simple thing to do. You could do that with a few words. You could say, well, it is Shabbat today. Welcome Holy Shabbat. Or you could read, Vayerev Vayvoker Yom HaShishi Vayichulu. Who says you have to say the whole blessing that we have for Kiddush? Well, the sages said to do that. That's our obligation, midurabanan. That's the way you have to make Kiddush. So Rabbi Soloveitchik says, yeah, sometimes when there's a verbal commandment, the rabbis ordain a specific text. So it could be that biblically, the text is not critical. When, Pesach night, we have a verbal commandment to tell the story of the Exodus. A lot of ways you could do that, shorter or longer. Well, we have a certain custom and certain mandated things that have to be said. So you might think that here too, perhaps you would think that maybe, and to use Robin's point, it's so short, the counting. Today is 5 days. Well, it's over before you even started. That's nothing, So we might think the rabbis put it, they ordained a blessing here. Maybe you would think that this is a mandatory framework, if not biblically, at least rabbinically. So the Rambam tells you, no, it's not the mandatory framework. So fine, it's not mandatory. I should say you're supposed to make a blessing, but if you don't make the blessing, you can still at least minimally fulfill your obligation. But it could be that actually there is some residue from this, that although it's not absolutely critical to fulfilling your obligation, there still is an idea here that the blessing and the counting are tightly coupled, that the blessing and the counting go together as an integral unit, that in fact, this is what the rabbis said, that the proper way to count is by doing so within don't just say, today is day 5. Start with a blessing, put it in the framework of a blessing. Now check this out. I'm going to show you that there was actually an earlier version of the blessing that is preserved in some of the leading Ashkenazi poskim, like France, Germany, from the around the 13th century, 14th century. The Ravya and Mordechai, these are very influential Ashkenazi leaders. And their version of the blessing went something like this. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu l'sfirat ha-Omer. Here's the blessing part. Kama shehayom, for example, Shiva Yamim, Shem Shavua Echad. Shehayom chamisha yamim la'Omer. It was a single sentence. Grammatically, they turned it into a single sentence. So it actually looks almost explicit that in their view, counting is part of the blessing. Or you might say the blessing and the counting are one integral whole. Just like Kiddush Friday night, the correct way to count is not simply to say the number of days, but to say that as incorporated in the text or the framework of a blessing formula. That's the way to count within a blessing. So that's what they held explicitly. Based on this Rambam and based on this Ravya and Mordechai, it's tempting to say that even in if you use our text of the blessing, where we don't make it grammatically a single sentence, we say the blessing but then immediately we count thereafter. Just because it's 2 sentences, it can still be a single integrated whole, a single unit. And the question I'm going to address at the end with you and discuss with you is why that might be, not just why, like as a practical matter, it gives us a little more to say, but what the underlying meaning this might express and reveal about what we're supposed to be doing when we count Sefirat ha-Omer. Why we put it in the framework of this blessing. So we will get to that. But before we do,
Steve?
Yes.
It's Emily. Hi.
Hi, Emily.
I just wanted to suggest that, and certainly the saying of the blessing where you use a comma, at least in English, reminds us that this is, yes, it's discrete, but it's part of a process. So this is just a segment of a larger, not just, this is a segment of a larger whole. And I think that you're being invited to remember that.
Each day, each night is one piece of a larger
Right.
a larger whole.
It's a thought.
Yeah. Interesting. If we're playing with ideas of components and unity of the whole, Sefira is a great place to do that. Okay, so yeah, this is just to summarize again. The suggestion here is that the blessing on counting Sefirat ha-Omer is not merely a prelude before performing the mitzvah, as is normally the case for the bracha before lulav or matzah or whatever. Rather, the preferred way to perform the underlying act of counting is by counting within the framework of the blessing. So these are an integral. The blessing itself is also an integral part of performing the mitzvah. Now, Rab Soloveitchik teaches this idea. What I would like to do is apply this to solve a very challenging puzzle. Now, Rav Soloveitchik also does that. However, so while I would encourage you, if you can, take a look at this Harei Kedem. I can send the excerpts to those who are interested. I'm not claiming that the way I'm doing this is not, I'm not mimicking what he said. So I got a lot of my ideas from there, but I'm going to present it. I'll take responsibility for what I'm presenting, because this is just what seems logical to me. It's a little different than what I saw his student explain. So I'm going to give you another question to think about here, and here's where the puzzle comes up. So imagine the following case: dealing with someone who is counting Sefirat, and as I'll admit, sometimes happens to the best of us, we get a little confused before we start about which day it is. Is tonight 23 or 24? Or was, what was last night? What's tomorrow night? And then there's this trick of, you can remember which night Pesach was, but you have to be good at doing mod 7 arithmetic. And it's easy enough to have an error if you're not in shul, especially with a bunch of other people. So let's say when Adi is about to count Sefira and they make the bracha, and have in mind they are convinced that today is number 4, and that's what they're going to count. But before they finish it, so part of the way through the bracha, they remember, oh no, it's actually number 5. And maybe they think to themselves, great, I remembered in time, because I didn't say the number yet. So now they finish the blessing and they're going to count. So here's the halachic question: should they simply go on and count the correct day because they remembered in time, or no, because they had should we say that because they had the wrong day in mind when they were making the blessing's no good? So they better say the blessing. It's like they didn't make the bracha at all. So don't count yet, because if you count, then you won't be able to count with the blessing. And the blessing that you recited is puzzle. It's invalid, because you had the wrong day in mind. So say the bracha over again. So if anyone has an intuition about this, you can prepare, get ready to, because I would take a poll if I could, but I'm curious to your thoughts. But I am going to throw out one more piece of information to help you a little bit. So take a look at this. Compare our case to the following. It is well known that if you make in halacha, if you make a blessing on food, and you have the wrong type of food in mind, the wrong category. By that I mean, like apples and grapes are the same category. They're both borei pri ha'etz. But if you're about to drink what you think is wine, and you're going to make a borei pri hagafen, but then you realize it's actually schnapps, and it needs a she'akol. That is the classic example, even given in the Gemara. So you can't make a borei pri hagafen on schnapps. You cannot. That wouldn't work. If that's what you had in mind as you were making the blessing. So the Gemara is of two minds about this. They have a dispute. The dispute is not resolved. Therefore, the blessing is deemed of doubtful validity. So if you had the wrong thing in mind during part of the blessing, but you remembered before the end, so you fixed the words at the end, but you had the wrong thing in mind when you were beginning, when you said Baruch Atah Hashem, you had the wrong thing in mind. It's doubtful, but because the rule in blessings in general is, if you have a blessing of doubtful validity, don't repeat it. That's the general rule in blessings. When in doubt, when you have a suffix of bracha, don't say it over again. When in doubt, don't repeat. So that would be the law for food. So if you picked up the cup of whiskey and you thought borei pri hagafen for part of it, but you remembered and you said the correct bracha shakol by the end, you would not have to repeat that blessing. We would say, well, there's some doubt here, but when in doubt, we'll be lenient. So something like that happening here, you thought it was going to be day 4, it's actually 5. You caught yourself in time by the end. So how would we analyze that? Do we think that you would repeat the blessing or not repeat the blessing before counting?
I would say no.
So on the food, does it make a difference if it's d'oraisa or drabanan? Meaning, would bracha achrona be different?
Go ahead. So I'm gonna already give you a prize, David. But if you perhaps I will give you 2 if you can spell out further. So how would you? What was the split
that was
look
one
like?
comment. The other comment was if you separate Shavuos and Yomim, does it matter if you're counting within the same week?
That we'll have to take offline. That's the weeks
Okay.
and days will get too complicated. But the Doraisa, the Rabbanan, biblical versus rabbinic, that is very, that's super relevant here. And so let's just finish the thought. So let's say we said a blessing that's made on food, that's a rabbinic obligation, generally, to make a blessing on food. And that's really what motivates the rule. So when in doubt, don't repeat the blessing. But here we have a blessing on an act of counting Sefirat, mitzvah, that's a biblical mitzvah, perhaps.
Right.
Some say it's biblical. So you might think that there, because the mitzvah is biblical, therefore repeat the blessing, something like that. So let's take a look.
Stephen, it would seem that the bracha is sort of generic as opposed to your previous example with the wrong food. The bracha doesn't say I'm going to count the fourth. It says I'm going to count. So
Right.
it shouldn't seem to matter as long as your intention was to count if you then realize that you were counting the wrong thing.
I love it. I love it. Yes. This is super helpful. Why does it even matter if you were thinking 4 or 5 at that point? I mean, yeah, maybe earlier in the night I had the wrong thing in mind. But who cares? I'm not counting yet. The bracha is generic. It would finish the same way. When you got to the part of the Hayom, if you remembered correctly, should be fine. On the other end, it's biblical. Maybe so. Let us take a look now at what the Ravya actually said about this. The Ravya ruled, yes, you must repeat the blessing because counting Omer is a biblical mitzvah. He reasons. So he goes out. I only have this part in. By the way, the Ravya is. I put a little note at the bottom. He stands for Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi, very prominent Tosafist, a prominent Ashkenazi authority who was very influential. His disciples went on to be very influential poskim. The Torah actually was a very important code. Follows this ruling. His father, the Rosh, was very influenced by the Ravya. But by the time we get to Shulchan Aruch, they disagree. The Shulchan Aruch says, no, do not repeat it. So I'm just pointing that out. Don't think, if this happens to you, what I'm teaching tonight, what we're learning is not the law. This is not halacha lemaisa. So easier rule to remember is when in doubt about a blessing, don't repeat it, even for Sefirat. But the Ravya said if you had the wrong day in mind during part of the blessing, you must repeat it because the underlying commandment here is biblical. He says, Sefirat d'oraisa. So the first part, he just quotes the thing about whiskey and wine from the Gemara that I mentioned. And he says, I think it's similar here, the Ravya says, because you had the wrong day in mind in your blessing, which if you'd finished all the way through counting, not just the blessing, but all the way through counting with this wrong day in mind, it would have been invalid. And since counting is a biblical mitzvah, therefore we should take this Talmudic principle that there's doubt when you have the wrong item in mind when you're reciting a blessing. This might be invalid. And if it were rabbinic, we wouldn't repeat it. But since the mitzvah is d'oraisa, as linan lachumra, we are going to be strict. Therefore, you must count, and you must do so with a bracha. Now, he says the blessing is not d'oraisa. You can count without a blessing and fulfill your biblical commandment. And the only time that you had the wrong thing in mind, the wrong day in mind, was when you were making the blessing, and the blessing's rabbinic. But he says, afagav de bracha lav d'oraisa, even though the blessing is not d'oraisa, kaven de Sefirat d'oraisa, but the counting is d'oraisa. It's tzarich lispor, and you must count. Well, yeah, I know, you must count. Lav milsa lispor below bracha. It wouldn't be right to count without a blessing. So it's not a bracha levatala to repeat it. This has puzzled for centuries. This has puzzled commentaries because the Ravya was adopted. This view was adopted by the Torah. Ravya himself, not such a well-read work anymore. Rabbi Lichtenstein, actually, Zatzal, was a great fan of the Ravya and very excited about kind of restoring interest in him. But what this ruling became famous because of the Torah. Torah adopted it, and it just flummoxed everybody. So the Shulchan Aruch rejects it, and the commentaries discuss what is he talking about here. Yes, the mitzvah is d'oraisa, But there's no problem with your counting there's no problem with your counting. You count the right day. You remembered to count the right day by the time you counted. The only problem is with your blessing. So nobody ever said that if you aren't sure about the blessing on a biblical commandment, that you need to repeat the blessing. It's true that if you're not sure if you fulfilled the underlying biblical commandment, you have to repeat that. That's true. And then you'd make a blessing when you repeat it. But here there seems to be no problem with your fulfillment of the blessing. Notice as I'm explaining the difficulty here, that I'm dividing between the blessing and the counting. The more we separate them, the harder this is to explain. You know, there was an error in the blessing, not in the counting. You're going to fulfill your counting. The counting's biblical. The blessing's rabbinic. The only problem is, why do you have to repeat it? Yeah, but maybe if you see them as an integrated whole, you actually did have the wrong intention when you were counting. And what Matthews asked about, well, wait, the bracha is generic. No, actually, according to the Ravya, the bracha is not generic. Only the first half of the blessing is generic, right? The part that we think of as the blessing that ends in a period, that's generic. But actually, the Ravya put a comma there. He's, you know, for him, the blessing goes all the way through the day. So for him, it's sort of one long text recital. It's an act of counting. It begins with the word Baruch, and it ends with the word, you know, Yamim ha-Omer. But that's really all one counting. So if you had the wrong number of days in mind during any part of that, during Baruch Atah Hashem, that's really like having the wrong days in mind while you are counting. So now your counting is flawed. You're counting, I'm supposed to count something, and I said 5, but when I started counting, I was thinking 4. Well, that's not a proper counting. So you have to do it over again. And once you have to do that, that's because it's a biblical mitzvah that has been, you know, befouled. It has been ruined by your improper intent during part of the counting. Now you have to repeat it again. So the proper way to repeat is with since it's biblical, you must repeat it again. And the proper way to do it is with a blessing, because you really haven't fulfilled anything yet. At least doubtfully, you haven't fulfilled anything. And at a biblical level, doubts we err on the side of strictness when it's doubtful. Does that, I'll switch back in a moment. Yes, here's, I'll take the opportunity to review this one more time so it sticks, and then I'll go back, get out of the slides, and we can discuss and take your questions a bit. So just again to review the puzzle here, the Ravya ruled that if you had the wrong day in mind during part of the blessing, but you corrected yourself in time for the actual counting, that's okay. Sorry, just the opposite. The Ravya ruled that that's not okay, that even though the only error in intention was while you were reciting the blessing, you have to repeat the blessing over again. That was the Ravya's ruling. You have to repeat the blessing over again because, after all, the mitzvah to count is doraisa, is biblical. So the commentaries say this seems very puzzling. The only doubt is about the blessing. The blessing is rabbinic. There's seemingly no question that counting the Omer is fulfilled, even if the blessing is invalid, because you can fulfill, after all, counting even with no blessing altogether. So why is the fact that counting is biblical sufficient grounds to be strict about some question of doubt that only applies to your blessing? And the answer we're suggesting is that the integral nature of the blessing and the counting means that our premise was incorrect. The only doubt is if the blessing is valid. No, that's not true. Even though the mistaken intent occurred while reciting the blessing is part of the counting. The blessing is where counting begins. It's all one framework. Starts with Baruch, but that's really you're reciting a blessing as a way of counting. So it's not merely a separate prelude. So if there's mistaken intent when you say Baruch Atah Hashem, that's mistaken intent during the act of counting, and it's doubtful if you fulfilled counting altogether. And since that's biblical, that therefore the counting must be treated strictly. That has to be repeated in case of doubt. And once we say that, you're really counting out of obligation, and so you do so with a blessing. You would repeat the blessing. That's a suggested explanation
If you accept that
Ravya.
suggestion,
Yes.
would you say that you could be Yotze with Sefira without making a bracha, but if you made the bracha with the wrong intent, then you wouldn't be Yotze? That's what I kind of hear you saying.
Sorry. Say that one more time, David.
If you take it to an extreme,
Yes.
according to what you're saying, had you not made a bracha at all,
Oh, yeah, right.
and you counted, you'd be Yotze, but making
Yes.
the bracha apostles the Sefira, or the bracha.
That's absolutely, and that it's putting it that way, I think, helps explain why this was so puzzling. That's really the point that commentaries like the Taz and the Levush emphasize. They say, well, by God, I mean, you can fulfill counting even if you make no blessing at all. So who cares if the blessing was invalid? So the point is, well, in accordance at least with the Ravya's way of thinking, the blessing, if you choose to make a blessing, then you are counting in that way. That's the way you're counting. So you're counting, and that's true, had you not said a blessing at all, so that's b'di'evid, that's a shorter form of counting. That's counting by itself. That's just saying today is day 5. But if you count with the complete formula, it starts with Baruch. Well, if you chose to do it that way, then the whole thing is considered to be one long formula of counting. You did the right thing. You adopted the long version, but then unfortunately you did the wrong thing. You had improper intent during part of it, and so you're worse off than had you in that sense than had you recited no blessing at all.
And you'd say the same thing if you made a bracha, he intended to count the wrong day, but then ended up counting the right day. You'd also say he'd have to count again.
Yeah, well, that according to the Ravya, that's the case. That is, Ravya gives both. Whether you remembered whether you were wrong at the beginning or wrong at the end. In all of those cases, you must repeat it, and that the Torah adapts that lahalacha. Although, as I've said, the Shulchan Aruch disagrees.
Yeah.
So,
Steven?
yes, please, Abba. Can I? We have to unmute you. There we go.
Yeah, so you began by saying that the Rambam chose this particular place to use as his example. So rather than saying this is a lenient case, we should really be saying this is a stringent case. So therefore we can learn by Kal V'chomer that if we don't have to say the bracha over here, then of course we don't have to say the bracha over for Hallel and for other places. So at the beginning we were trying to say that this is a lenient case, therefore we don't. But in fact, this must therefore be a stringent case, either because it's intertwined in the same bracha, or it's midiraisa, not midirabbanan. But there has to be something stringent about this.
Right. Yes, or both. I agree completely. It's stringent. They're intertwined, and because the underlying commandment might be biblical, many hold that it's biblical. You wind up with a blessing that is it's more like, as Rav Soloveitchik said, it's more like Kiddush Friday night, and you might really think that it's indispensable. But the Rambam is saying no. It's preferred. This is the preferred formula.
Mm-hmm.
But you can b'di'evid, you can be yotze with the short form without the blessing, but you shouldn't do that. But if you did b'di'evid, you fulfill your obligation. Just today, I got another interesting kind of support for this. I heard from Rabbi Lichtenstein's daughter, Esti Rosenberg, the head of Migdal Oz. So she's giving a shir in which she happened to mention in passing that Sfaradi, so women who follow Sfaradi practice, if they choose to do mitzvot such as picking up a lulav that women are not absolutely strictly obligated in, if they choose to do it, so Ashkenazi custom is they can make a bracha too. Sfaradi practice following the Beit Yosef is they don't make the bracha asher kishanu b'mitzvotav. They're encouraged to do the mitzvah, but it's not obligatory, and as if to underscore that, they don't make the blessing. So she said in passing, Esti Rosenberg, that she started with the example of Sefirat, and then she said, no, that's not a good example. Actually, for Sefirat, could be even Sephardi women would make the blessing. She didn't explain why, and it wasn't live. I couldn't ask, it was YouTube recording, but this would explain, yeah, I mean, if that is true, if that is the case, that could be because it's seen as a single unit. It's actually seen as part of the counting. It's not just a separate prelude blessing. This is the proper way to count. So if you're going to count it all, this is the proper way to do it. So that may explain why that's true even in Sephardi practice for women who count. Okay, so what I would like to do, kind of as the third and closing unit here, is to think with you to consider what takeaway we might have kind of beyond the legalistic, beyond the sort of analytical. What does this say about the meaning of the mitzvah of Sefirat ha-Omer? Why would the rabbis have established this this mitzvah of counting to be done preferably with a blessing as an integral whole? I mean, they asked us to introduce every mitzvah with a blessing as a prelude, but why go further here and kind of create it as an integrated text? Now, you could say, as maybe Robin was getting at the beginning, perhaps it's just, well, because counting is a very short text, it's very simple, and let's enhance it a bit. Let's make it more a little bit more dramatic and memorable. But I'd like to actually reach even a bit further and kind of explore whether there is something special about the meaning of counting Omer, which is enhanced in kind of a unique and particular way by beginning with the formula Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. And to get at that, the question that I guess we start with is, well, why do we count Omer? What do you, I don't think there's a clear answer to this, by the way, in the Talmud. But later, post-Talmud writings, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim and others subsequently certainly talk quite a bit about what we can learn from Sefirat ha-Omer, why we do it. So what do you think? What have you what have people heard? Why do we count Omer?
Steve?
Yes.
Yes, Emily. Well, there are two ways of counting, backwards and forwards. And clearly we're moving towards something with a tremendous anticipation. In the olden days, the anticipation for the harvest was certainly big enough. But precisely because the Torah doesn't mention that Shavuot is Zman Matan Torah, it would seem to me that the rabbis wanted to strengthen, first of all, introduce and then strengthen the religious aspect of Omer by inviting us or telling us to say something that is specifically spiritual, and it both integrates the agricultural and the religious, and it also reminds us that remind yourself that this is not just an agricultural counting. And I think that then ultimately you remember that even the agricultural is not without a religious dimension. That's what I'm thinking.
That's there was a lot in that. If you don't mind, I want to say that back to you, and I'll try to summarize, and tell me if I heard it right. You hit on several, I think three at least, good key points here. One was that we are counting in anticipation. In anticipation of what? So perhaps in anticipation of the harvest that's coming, the great, early summer harvest that we're longing for. Oh, but then there's actually a higher, more spiritual thing. Maybe we're anticipating Matan Torah, and that by reciting this blessing at the beginning, blessing is spiritual in nature, reminds us what we're doing here is fulfilling our duties to God, performing a commandment. That kind of orients us towards the more spiritual goal, that we're counting towards Matan Torah and acceptance of the commandments. Is that?
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Any other thoughts about Sefirat?
I mean, there's.
Oh, sorry.
No,
No,
please
go.
go ahead, Zala.
No, I've heard the idea that it's almost like a quasi Chol HaMoed Sefira, because it's like connecting two holidays, and of course we can't have a holiday for 50 days, but it's almost like an intrinsic way of connecting the two ends. I
like that. The Chol HaMoed, I think the Ramban mentions that in his commentary in Chumash, and I have noticed the last few years, especially Israelis seem very proud of how they have successfully populated increasingly the days between Pesach and Shavuot with these very meaningful memorial days, days of commemoration, celebration, and really are kind of fleshing it out as almost a extended Chol HaMoed between Pesach and Shavuot.
It also establishes when Shavuot will be.
Yeah, that is the most fundamental or basic, I guess, pshat. If we're just reading in the Torah, count the days. Why? Because what I want you to do is make a holiday with special sacrifices when you get to 50. So, count the days, just like count the years for Shemitah, and then 49 of them. 7 of them Shemitah, 49, you get the Yovel. Here we have the same kind of thing. Count it so that to establish the holiday at the end.
Before Pesach, I don't remember who gave this year, but it was through that, I think that Sephardi program, where he was talking about how there was the idea of leaving bechipazon, leaving in an urgent way. But the truth was that it wasn't, they knew they were leaving, but there was this concept of urgency associated with leaving Mitzrayim because there's certain, like life changes that need to be done in an urgent way. You need to seize the moment. But that real change happens over time, and that Sefira, the counting from Pesach to Shavuot, is that building process, because really moving from slavery to freedom to being able to receive the Torah is respecting that the need to kind of go through a process.
Mm-hmm. I like that. That's that's inspiring. Gives us, sort of work to think about each year, how we can kind of progress, and goes well with counting up as we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., rather than counting down the way people do if they're waiting for retirement or a birthday or something like that. They might be more inclined to count down in anticipation. Here we're counting up because we need to grow towards that end point. Well, these are all good, and some of them may play better or not with the with trying to explain how the blessing and the bracha of Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav in particular plays in and kind of enhances the effect of the counting. I want to focus on the approach that's kind of a familiar one, that is part of what Emily said. A piece of it that we are counting towards Matan Torah, and this is what the Sefer HaChinuch gives as this explanation. And I think the Rambam already gives this as his explanation more briefly in the Guide to the Perplexed. So the Sefer HaChinuch writes that the simple explanation for this mitzvah of Sefirah is that we were commanded to count from the day after the first Yom Tov of Pesach until the day of the giving of the Torah, to show in ourselves. So to, leharot benafshenu, to show in ourselves, this really means to express, to help, I guess, build the feeling in ourselves of a great desire for the honored day. The honored day. What honored day? Which our hearts yearn for, like a slave who seeks shade or is constantly counting when will the yearned for time arrive when he goes free. I mean, the honored day means the day of the giving of the Torah. Counting shows that all of a person's hope and desire is to reach the time that he'll get to at the end of that counting. That's it's very poetic and lovely way to think of this counting. So now, when you think about the bracha of Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, or let me put it this way: if you think of counting without the bracha, for example, Hayom Shiva Yamim Shem Shavua Echad LaOmer. Well, you definitely got the calendar, nailed that. You know what day it is, and this will help us determine with precision when to celebrate Shavuos. But we have not really said anything. We have not expressed anything overtly here about anticipating Matan Torah or yearning for anything. There's no yearning in this. Perhaps it's implicit. Maybe we all know that that's what we're doing, so you can fulfill the obligation minimally with this. But have you really have you fulfilled the mitzvah in the best way? Have you milked it for the full experiential value? Versus, now compare when you add the blessing. So the blessing of Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us. That's the same formula for any mitzvah, but when you think about it, what's it really expressing? So for example, the Avud Raham, who has his Sefer Avud Raham, his whole book is like a commentary on the Siddur and on our regular rituals. And he explains what the texts mean. So he comments on one of the first things we say in the morning is Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al natilat yadayim every day. So commenting on and explaining that, he says, why Asher Kiddushanu, who sanctified us? So he gives a few explanations, and then he says, Yesh mefarshim shehu lashon erusin v'kiddushin. Look at that. Some explain sanctified us with commandments in the same sense as Harei at mekudeshetli, kiddushin, marriage, betrothal. God betrothed Israel through the commandments, as it is written famously in Hosea, ve'erastich li le'olam, ve'erastich li b'tzedek v'mishpat v'chesed v'rachim, ve'erastich li be'emunah. So the Hosea is ve'erastich li be'emunah. The mitzvot are referred to as faith, says the Abarbanel, and he quotes another verse, Kol mitzvotecha emunah. Your commandments are faith for me. Experience of faith. So when God says, I betrothed you to me in faith, means I betrothed you to me, Israel, by bestowing upon you the gift of the commandments and the responsibility of the commandments. So we're invoking that, we're evoking that feeling every time as we're about to do any mitzvah. We remind ourselves of this great loving relationship we're in, and what we're doing is an act of it expresses the relationship of kiddushin that we have with God, not just kiddusha, sanctity, but kiddushin, almost like marriage. Very powerful. So that, of course, harkens back to Matan Torah, which is the day of, the moment of Erusin v'Kiddushin. That is the moment of God's kiddushin with Israel. That is where we see ourselves as wedded and betrothed to God. I also happened to see just recently somebody put a lecture on YouTube called Birkat HaMitzvot, a daily Kabbalat Torah. So the blessing, this blessing, Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav, said Rabbi Nathaniel books. It's a opportunity, a frequent opportunity all the time to kind of express and experience our relationship with God in receiving the commandments, a relationship that the Abarbanel, the Avud Raham describes as akin to marriage. So if we say that what beautiful words, no more powerful words than that to introduce counting sphere. If the point is to express a yearning for this great moment, this Yom Nichbad, this august occasion of receiving the Torah, where we do enter into kiddushin with God. You know, what better way to kind of set the tone for that than to remind ourselves by saying Asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. So the rabbis said this is the proper formula for if you want the real experience of Sefirat ha-Omer, the full experience, the full kiyum, and you do it in this in the context of the formula of a bracha, and in particular Birkat HaMitzvah, Shekishanu b'mitzvotav. You can fulfill the obligation minimally, b'di'evet, just by counting. Today is day 7, but you know, ideally you get more bang for the experience if you introduce it with the Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav. Any comments or questions? Yes, Emily.
In fact, we're a little punished if we forget to say the bracha on one day, if I'm not mistaken. Then you can't say the bracha anymore.
Well, I think what you are thinking is that if you forget to count,
forget to count, period.
Perhaps because counting is seen as you got to count from 1 to 49, and if you leave out 36, then you didn't count, or something like that. This is the Bahag's opinion that to fulfill the mitzvah in entirety, you have to count every day, and therefore not to make a blessing if going forward if you skip a day.
Right. So that I always that has happened to me on occasion, and I always experienced it as a little punishment. Like, oh, too bad. Can't I say the bracha?
I hear you. I hear you. But if you just left out the blessing one day, which, for example, would happen if one forgot to count at night, but remembered during the daytime. So they would count in the morning without a blessing, but then from then on, all the remaining nights they would count with a blessing. That's at least the way halacha. That's the common psak.
Right.
So, in conclusion, the blessing is much more than a standard prelude. The blessing before Sefirat, even if we don't treat it as a single sentence, we can at least treat it as a single integrated unit where the recital of Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav expresses the lofty destination that we are yearning towards, which is the honored day, as the Sefer Chinuch called it, of receiving Torah and mitzvot. And so that bracha really helps us better fulfill, arguably, the purpose of the underlying mitzvah, to count Sefirat ha-Omer. That's all I got, and I thank you for all of your questions and comments and good ideas and suggestions, and your being here to participate with me. I hope we shall all continue to enjoy the rest of these.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
And good evening.
Night.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.